Share my screen. All right. Well, welcome to chapter 5 of the book of Revelation. So again, chapter 1 has been the introduction to the book, introducing who's writing it, introducing what he is seeing and who he's writing to. And then chapter 2 and 3, the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, with the overarching call for them to overcome, modeled upon the Son of Man's own overcoming. And then chapter 4, we had the heavenly scene, temple scene, with the throne in the center of the cosmos, really. And we get to see the one who sits upon it. And so chapter 5 is another angle of vision. So we'll just take it verse by verse tonight. So John says, and again, he's been called up to heaven through the open door. He's been recording the visions, and now we have another vision that says, I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a book written inside and on the back, sealed up with 7 seals. So once again, we are submerged in this, the same vision from chapter 4. So once again, we have the throne, we have the one who sits on the throne, but now we have an added or an additional feature of the one who sits on the throne. We see something more, that he's holding a book or a scroll. Now, we say a book or a scroll just because historically either is an option. There was, of course, scrolls were used, particularly in the Jewish synagogue, to hold scripture. But the practice of creating books, cutting sheets down and binding them was a process as well. It's not a big detail. We'll just use book because it's a more familiar term for us, but it could be a scroll too. And right away, this scene evokes Ezekiel 2, chapter 9, the second half, and chapter 10. And again, Yahweh with a book in heaven. And then the book being sealed with 7 seals is merging the context from Daniel chapter 12 and Isaiah chapter 29, verse 11. So those are all in the background of what's happening here. And again, that's a continuation out of chapter 4, Ezekiel being a part of the background, Daniel certainly being a part of the background, and we saw Isaiah a part of the background. So it is those same books, the apocalyptic revelation, that is, again, John is taking over here. So, but largely he is still following the Daniel 7 outline. And then we have in verse 2, and I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the book and to break its seals? So here we have this heavenly spokesperson who is addressing the cosmos. So again, this being the center of the cosmos, and cosmos just means creation. So here's the center of creation. The angel is surrounding it. This is where the book is. And so the call comes out of that center of the cosmos, and it goes to all of the cosmos. And of course, the cosmos is what is surrounding the throne, right? With the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders. We have all of creation surrounding the throne. And that angel or that spokesperson is asking for someone who is worthy or able or has the authority to open the book and to unseal its seals or to loose its seals. And of course, you're familiar with seals, the wax, which is imprinted. If that's intact, it shows that the letter hasn't been opened, hasn't been read. If it's broken, then that would indicate it has been um, opened and read. So this is the book. It has 7 seals, meaning that it is quite closed. So the angel is calling out to all of creation for someone who is worthy or able or has authority to open this book and to loose its seals. Note there that he talks about opening the book before loosening the seals. That might seem odd to us. It is odd. You shouldn't be able to open the book until you've loosened the seals, but it's not a problem from our point of view. Um, Really, what we just need to pick up on is the emphasis is on somebody who has the authority to take possession of this book. So in chapter 5, verse 9 of Revelation, um, we have the book that gets opened. And then in chapter 6, we actually have the unsealing. So that pattern remains. So don't be thrown too much by that. That's not a big deal. Well, question is, what is this book? And there are lots of different interpretations in terms of what this book could be. So one is that this is a book of redemption. So this is the Lamb's book of life. All of the names of those who have been redeemed are written on the front and on the back because the names are too numerous to be contained just on the inside. There is an issue with that interpretation. Um, the contents of the book as it is unsealed and opened throughout the process of the book of Revelation is that it is not just about the elect of the Lamb, but it also has an aspect of judgment on unbelievers. A second idea or interpretation would be that this is the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, the canon of the Hebrew scriptures for the Jewish people. Um, if that were the case, then only Christ can unlock the true meaning of the Old Testament because it finds its fulfillment in him. So Christ then would be essential to understanding that. Another interpretation is a book which contains the future events of the Great Tribulation. So obviously that would be a futurist reading of this book. Um, if that were the case, then these would be events that are leading up to the second coming of Christ, to the salvation of the saints, and to the final judgment. We talked about last week that the book of Revelation is not just describing future events, but it also includes past and present events as well. Another idea is that this is a book that contains God's plan of judgment and redemption. So God's plan of judgment and redemption is set in motion by Christ's death and resurrection, yet it awaits completion. So the question is asked by the angel, who in the created order has the sovereign authority over the plan. And so the book then represents the authority in executing the divine plan, which is expressed in the 2 hymns of chapter 5. And then lastly, the book can be understood as a testament as well, in a legal sense, as in the last will and testament of somebody. So the book is a testament that names an inheritance to be received by a people. The book should be read as a covenantal promise of an inheritance. If we are reading in the hymns, that seems to be what it is. And in the context of Revelation as a whole, it seems to concern the paradise that's been lost and regained. So God had promised Abraham to rule over the earth, which he forfeited when he sinned. But Christ, who is the last Adam, was to inherit it. So a human person had to be the one to open the book because the promise was made to humanity, for humanity to rule. And again, that's the image of God that we've already talked about a couple of times through our study of Revelation, and we've seen it in other places, other Christian ed and sermon series in the past. So that call goes out to creation because it's creation that needs to respond, but no human was found worthy because, of course, as Romans reminds us, all have sinned, and so all are ultimately under the judgment of the book. However, Christ was worthy because he suffered final judgment as an innocent sacrificial victim on behalf of his people, whom he represented and redeemed, and he was raised from the dead. So Christ then is able to inherit the promise, that is, to open the book, as do all who are represented by him. So again, that concept that we are seated with Christ in the heavenly places, that's Ephesians. And we've been seeing that in the book of Revelation, that we share in the life and rule of Christ in the heavenly places as his people. So the covenantal promise of the book is comprehensive in manner, which is why there is writing on the back of the book as well as on the inside. So because this covenant promise is so fulsome, it isn't just written on one side, it also covers the back. And that's also the seven seals represents the fullness of this revelation. So here the seals, the opening of them or the unsealing of them is the revealing that is happening. So once the seals are opened, then the readers can understand the nature of the book and as a result, the purpose of history. They can understand that even their suffering is according to God's will and can be comforted by entrusting themselves to him. Despite the chaos of the world, there is an ordered eschatological plan. And again, don't get thrown off by the word eschatological. It's just the 25-cent word for the end times, the future picture, God's fulfilled new creation plan, which can't be thwarted. So nothing that happens in our world, in John's day or in our day, anywhere in between, leading right up to the coming of Christ again, can derail God's plan. In fact, that plan is already being fulfilled, as we've already seen. We have the already, and we're looking forward to the not yet. So we're looking for the consummation of what Christ has started through his death and resurrection. So this partial background to a Roman will, there's some features that are interesting. Contents at times on a Roman will were summarized on the back of the will. It had to be witnessed and sealed by 7 witnesses. Only upon death could a will be unsealed and legal promise of inheritance be executed. And of course, we're going to see Jesus as the Lamb who was slain. And a trustworthy executor would put the will into effect. So it's important to remember as we read through this and through all of the book of Revelation that John is combining different images without necessarily importing the full meaning of the original context. So while he's pulling on Daniel and Isaiah and Ezekiel, it doesn't mean that we have to take on board everything that was going on at the time of those original settings. And because of that, it might be that as we examine the symbolism that John uses, that we want to be careful that we don't try and press things too far, because he is stacking up images that he doesn't necessarily intend for his readers to plumb to their depths. And so we do run the risk of over-interpreting what John is doing. And you probably want to ask the question, well, how would we know if we're over-interpreting? Is a good question. Let's keep going. So verse 3, and no one in heaven or on the earth or under the earth was able to open the book or to look into it. So the angel's question is met with only silence. No created being is able to open or read the book, demonstrating the inability of any of God's creatures to execute his plan of redemption and judgment. So that's what's happening in the scene. When the question is put out there, who's worthy? The answer is nobody is worthy. Nobody has the necessary purity or authority in order to actually execute God's plan of redemption and judgment. We may have an allusion here to Isaiah chapter 29, verses 11 to 12 and verse 18. There it said that no one was able to look into the book or to read it because it was sealed. And so again, here we have the sealed book in this heavenly vision as well. Then I began to weep greatly because no one was found worthy to open the book or to look in it. So John cannot receive the knowledge of the revelation because no one is found worthy. His commission is to write what he sees. There's this implicit promise in having the book there. And of course, John is pastor of congregations that are suffering. And so there's this promise that the suffering is going to make sense in light of the revelation, but now he hits this point where there's no one found to reveal the revelation, and so he is heartbroken. He's in despair because it appears that the book seals cannot be broken and God's plan will not be carried out. So that's the other implication. The seals can't be broken and the book can't be opened, then the playing out of God's history cannot be done. So he's in despair. So his initial impression may have been also that not even Jesus was worthy to unlock the book's secrets and power, which again meant that history would not be governed in the interest of the church. So if the church's Lord is not worthy to open the seals and open the scroll, then the church's history is dark indeed. So it would also mean that there would be no protection for God's children during the trial, no judgment on the persecuting world, no ultimate triumph for believers, and no new heaven and earth, no future inheritance. So it's just bleak at that point, well worth weeping over. So the image of the book in verses 1 to 4 comes from the books of Daniel, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. But again, with Daniel 7 having the leading influence in these first 4 verses, deals with this cosmic significance, this cosmic judgment against the kingdoms of the world. And so in part, we take on that meaning. So here we are again. Daniel looked forward to the time when the kingdoms of the world will be judged, and John is bringing that forward into this scene. The Ezekiel and the Isaiah references, on the other hand, are associated with a more limited or localized judgment within the people of Israel itself. So here, John is combining these things. So judgment on the people of God, judgment on the kingdom of the world, as well as promises for those who are faithful to have an inheritance. And again, we've already seen that in the letters to the 7 churches. We had both promises and warnings given to the 7 churches. And one of the elders said to me, "Stop weeping. Behold, the Lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome so as to open the book and its 7 seals." So we now have another heavenly proclamation that is responding to John's distress. Look, there's a messianic figure who has overcome in order to open the book. These 2 descriptions of Christ, Lion from the tribe of Judah and the root of David are from Genesis. So Lion of the tribe of Judah from Genesis 49, verse 9. And then the root of David from Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1 and verse 10. So the word overcome, conquer, introduces these two Old Testament titles and brings out their conquering significance out of their original context. Both of these references are prophesying about a messianic figure who will overcome his enemy through judgment. So overcome is also related to the last clause in verse 5 here, the opening of the seals, the opening of the book and its seals. And that, of course, is repeating Daniel chapter 7, verse 10, and Daniel chapter 12, verse 4 and 9. And those were already alluded to back in verse 2. All of that means that Christ's overcoming of the enemy places him in a sovereign position to execute the divine plan of redemption and judgment that is symbolized by opening the book and its seals. That's all it means. So overcoming means overcoming the enemies just means that Christ is in the sovereign position to do the divine plan of both redemption and judgment. And that's what is symbolized in the undoing of the seals and the opening of the book. Our next section is verses 6 to 7, and they're just broken up. So the first half of verse 6, and I saw between the throne with the four living creatures and the elders a lamb standing as if slain, having 7 horns. In the Greek, it literally says, in the midst of the throne and in the midst of the living beings and elders stands the lamb. So some of my comments will only make sense if you know that, because our translation here, the NASB, has already done some of the work for us. So rather than being in the midst of the throne, you have between the throne, because we see a little later in verse 7 that the lamb approaches the throne. So they've already done some of the work for us. So in the midst of Ezekiel's living beings, remember that's where that picture comes from, and Isaiah's elders, remember that's we saw that last week, stands a lamb as slain. So in the midst of the throne could suggest that he is on the throne, but as I just said a moment ago, it's more likely that it refers to this inner court area. Again, remember, we're in a temple scene, even though we haven't always as clearly seen the temple around us, but we are in this temple scene. So we're in the inner court area around the throne, and we will see in verse 7 the lamb approaching the throne. So the lamb is near the throne, preparing to approach it in order to be enthroned on it. So we have two sources for a slain lamb. Of course, we have the Old Testament Passover lamb. Think of Exodus and then all of the Torah commandments observing the Passover. So we have the Passover lamb, a lamb that is slain. And then we also have Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, where it says he is led like a sheep to slaughter. Both of these carry significance of sacrifice of the lamb, which accomplishes redemption and victory for God's people. Isaiah 53 highlights the atoning aspect of the lamb's death and applies the metaphors of root and lamb to the sacrificial victim. So Isaiah uses all of these metaphors. The sacrificial victim's prophesied sinlessness in Isaiah 53, verse 9, underlies the worthiness of Jesus in 5:9. So I've given you the two scripture references there. Isaiah 53, verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. Um, Gospel writers pick up on that with Jesus not trying to defend himself, remaining silent. And then verse 9, his grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. So there's this purity. So we have this sense of sinlessness um, of Jesus, which underlies the sense of him being worthy, that we'll see in chapter 5, verse 9 in a few minutes. Uh, and he has 7 horns, having 7 horns. The horns represent power, and that comes from some Jewish writing that is not a part of the canon of the Hebrew scriptures, but it was a accepted way to understand horns mean power. So, like a ram's horn would mean power. So, again, the horns continue on that idea of this one as the one who overcomes, this Messiah who overcomes. He has these 7 horns. Those 7 horns represent the fullness of his strength. So the slain lamb is an image of a conqueror who was mortally wounded while defeating an enemy. So Christ's death becomes a sacrifice that both redeems and conquers. Now, verse 6 is crucial to understand how the Lion from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, overcame by then portraying him as resurrected, which is essential for his overcoming. He conquered death by being raised from the dead. So the present victorious effect of the Lamb's overcoming also resides in the fact that he continues to exist as a slaughtered lamb. Let me try and just say that in a different way. It is significant when Jesus is raised in the Gospels and he visits with his disciples. He says, go ahead and touch my wounds. You can put your fingers into the holes on my hand. You can put your hand in my side. So he is raised wounded. The book of Revelation gives us a vision of Jesus. He remains wounded. So humanity's ongoing redemption and the world's ongoing judgment is still very much grounded on the crucifixion of Jesus. And so it is a past action that has enduring effect in the present. So he remains wounded, and that is important. So his victory continues because his crucified nature continues. So this defeat of death was an ironic victory for Christ. The lion overcame by being slaughtered as a lamb, which is the critical event of chapter 5. So John wants us to see that juxtaposition. He hears about the Lion of the tribe of Judah, but when he looks, he sees the lamb that was slain. So those two things go together. His overcoming, his conquering, his powerfulness comes out of his submission and surrender to death. And so the title of Lamb becomes a substitute in the book of Revelation for his other messianic titles, things like Son of Man that we've already seen. So John is attempting to emphasize that Jesus began to fulfill these Old Testament prophecies like Daniel 7, like Isaiah, like Ezekiel. He's brought all of those things forward, and he now says, look, here we have the lamb that was slain, and that becoming the dominant title for the Messiah indicates that it was through that death that these Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah's kingdom came to be in an ironic manner. They came to be fulfilled in an ironic manner, not through power of sword or army, but through death. And so the Messiah's final victory and his reign can begin to be achieved by the suffering of the cross, which is why John juxtaposes lion and lamb. So this implies that believers should remember that Christ suffered at the hands of the world too, but ultimately triumphed over it. His destiny will be their destiny if they persevere. So again, hear the echoes of the letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3. Persevere. Again, it's all rooted in Jesus's own experience. The Lamb will not only conquer death, but all of the persecutors of his people too, through historical punishments and through a final judgment. So Christ overcame by maintaining his loyalty to the Father through suffering and death. Physically, he was defeated, but spiritually, he is victorious. And as an innocent victim, he became a penal substitute. Legal terminology meaning he took the place of somebody who was guilty. So he became a penal substitute for the sins of his people, so that while suffering the defeat of death, he was also at the same time overcoming by creating a kingdom of redeemed subjects whom he would reign over, and over whom the devil himself would no longer have power. So the defeat of the cross was the beginning of the established kingdom of the Lamb. 6b, and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. So the 7 eyes and the 7 spirits is dependent on Zechariah chapter 3 and 4. Zechariah 3 verse 9 says that the 7 eyes uses the 7 eyes as a divine inscription set before the high priest, who is Joshua, which is the Hebrew name of Jesus, by the way. Joshua and Jesus are the same name. So here in Zechariah 3:9, we have the high priest Jesus. We have this divine inscription of the 7 eyes set before him, and it concerns the removal of sin of the land all in one day. In Zechariah chapter 4, verse 2, the 7 lamps, and in chapter 4, verse 10, we have the 7 eyes are associated with Yahweh's omnipotent spirit. So John has taken that and has interpreted the 7 eyes of Zechariah as Yahweh's spirit, and he has identified those eyes and spirits as a possession of the Lamb. So he not only has the 7 horns, but he has the 7 eyes, which he tells us are the 7 spirits of God. And those are sent into all of the earth. So it's only by the spirit of Yahweh's servant, the branch, which is the messianic lamb, that sin has been removed from the world and resistance to the kingdom has been overcome. The 7 spirits of God, the 7 burning lamps, have been confined to the throne room, implying that they are agents of God's operations throughout the world. But as a result of the death and resurrection of Jesus, these spirits become Christ's agents throughout the world, who represents the Holy Spirit himself. The Spirit carries out the sovereign plan of the Lord. Just a quick side note, one of the theological discussions that are out there is who sends the Spirit? Is it the Father that sends the Spirit, or is it the Father and the Son that send the Spirit? If you like theological arguments, that kind of thing, I'll make your eyes blink. Okay, verse 7. The Lamb came and took the book out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne. So the Lamb approaches the throne now. In Daniel 7:13 is the only Old Testament text of a divine Messiah-like figure, And I'm sorry, I had meant to pull Daniel 13 and make a slide of that, and I failed to do so. It's an important text. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. A lot of the New Testament leads back to this. So we have this Old Testament text of a divine Messiah-like figure who approaches the heavenly throne to receive authority. So Daniel 7:13 and Revelation 5, verse 7 portray one who comes before God's throne to receive authority to reign after a book has been opened. The receiving of authority places Christ in a position together with his Father as Lord of all affairs of heaven and earth, because he's received that book. In fact, what happens now is he is the one who exercises the Father's reign because it has been handed over to him, as we'll see in chapter 6, verses 1 to 8 next week. So Revelation chapter 5, verses 8 to 10 now. So in this section, 8 to 10, we have this hymn, which is interpreting the vision of 1 to 8. So the Lamb was able to take the book because his death redeemed a people which he created to serve God as kings and priests. So verse 8, when he had taken the book, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each one holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. So this verse begins to describe the effects of the Lamb taking that authority. The saints may refer to the saints in Daniel 7, since both references speak of saints, particularly immediately after a divine figure's approach to the heavenly throne and reception of authority. The saints' prayers are identified with the prayers in chapter 6, verse 9 to 11 of Revelation, and chapter 8, verse 4 and forward. And those are prayers that call for divine vindication of martyred believers, people who have remained faithful and have suffered even unto death. And their prayers for the call for judgment on the ungodly. So the prayers here are praises as well as requests that God defend his reputation for justice by judging the persecutors of his people. This shows the continued pastoral concerns that John has for those who are suffering that we saw in chapter 4. The elders are those who hold harps and bowls and sing the new song in verses 9 to 10. These 24 elders are modeled on the 24 orders of the Levites who were commissioned to prophesy in giving thanks and praising the Lord by singing to accompaniment of lyres, harps, and cymbals. And you'll find that in 1 Chronicles chapter 25, verses 6 to 31. There you have a description of 24 Levites. Here we have the 24 elders. And they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals. For you were slain and purchased for God with your blood, men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And remember, NASB is just trying to be as literal as they can to the original. So go ahead and put men and women from tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And again, notice the 4 terms. Again, earth has the number 4 is its association. So verses 9 to 10 give the content of the new song. In the Old Testament, a new song is always an expression of praise for God's victory over the enemy, sometimes including thanksgiving for God's work of creation. So it's not like it has to be a brand new song every time, but every time God does something, every time God is victorious over his enemy, then his people sing a new song, a song to that victory. So this new song celebrates the defeat of evil and of sin. The word new in new song links with Christ's redemptive work with the beginning of the new creation. We know that because this vision flows out of the mention of God's work of creation, which we saw in chapter 4, verse 11. The hymns of chapter 5, verses 12 to 13 are about Christ and the redemptive work. That hymn is parallel to the hymn about God in chapter 4, verse 11, which was about God's work of creation. The word new is used of the coming renovated creation 3 times in chapter 21. So when we hear new, we should be thinking of renewal. The Jewish writings link the Old Testament new songs with the coming of the Messianic age. And again, that's a new creation. And then new may be developing the hint of the new creation that we found in chapter 4, verse 3. Remember the rainbow around the throne. That is a promise of new creation in Noah's day. And so that meaning is carried into Revelation. The hymns of verse 9 to 12 emphasize Jesus's deity more than any other New Testament passage by addressing the Lamb in the same way as it addressed God in chapter 4, verse 11, and chapter 5, verse 13. So particularly, they say, worthy are you. And that is how they address God. God is worthy of praise. And now they are saying the Lamb is worthy of praise. And that should remind us that the worship of the Lamb at all demonstrates that he is divine, he has deity, since John implies in chapter 22, verse 9, that worship belongs to God alone. So if Jesus didn't share in the divine personhood of God, then it would be inappropriate for creation to worship him. So worthy is further explained in verse the last part of verse 9 and into verse 10. The Lamb overcomes through death is the grounds for his worthiness to receive that sovereign authority. Another basis for his worthiness is the fact that he has purchased a people and has made them priestly kings. The clause, you were slain and purchased, emphasizes the redemptive nature of the Lamb's death. So it's his death which purchased us. This redemption is not of all peoples without exception, but of all without distinction. It's all peoples without distinction. So peoples from every race, but it doesn't mean every single person. Okay? And that's made clear a little later in chapter 14, verse 3 and 4 and verse 6. So the phrase of every tribe, tongue, and people and nation is coming out of the book of Daniel as well. And there it means the inhabitants of the world. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. So again, the Daniel influence is behind the redeemed people groups in verse 9, is here strengthened by the fact that the terms are followed by Christ giving saints a kingdom in the description of the saints reigning. That's the same as in Daniel chapter 7, verse 14. And I've shown it there. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. We may also have Daniel 7:22b and chapter 7:27a standing behind verse 10 as well. So the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom, then the sovereignty of the dominion and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. So you can hear the resonances in Revelation. The Septuagint notes that the saints' kingdom and highlights the active aspect of the saints' earthly reign in verse 27a. So Both Revelation 5:10 and Daniel 7:22 and 27 share four elements: a giving of a kingdom to the saints at the end of time, a reigning activity of the saints, um, a three or fourfold formula denoting the universality of what's happening, the giving of sovereign authority to the divine messianic figure. We also have here an influence of Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. It is reworking Revelation chapter 1, verse 5c to 6a in light of the Passover idea of the slain lamb. So again, we have this kingdom of priests and saints, which is coming out of Exodus. We've already seen it in chapter 1, verse 5 and 6. So the Exodus idea of a kingdom and a priesthood are now universalized. It applies to every people, tribe, tongue, nation, not simply to Israel alone. And that is woven in with the concept of the saints in this universal kingdom of Daniel 7. So Exodus and Daniel 7 are brought together here. So again, in Exodus 19:5, Israel is chosen from among the nations to become a kingdom and priest. Now in Revelation 5:9, Israel's election from all the nations has been widened by interweaving Daniel 7 to include people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So the slain lamb of the Israel cult from Exodus, the Passover lamb, has become the end time king of the cosmos. So the connection with chapter 1, verse 5 and 6 shows that the saints were made a kingdom by release from their servitude to sin, which is prefigured by Israel's release from Egyptian servitude by the blood of the Passover lamb. So those are some of the metaphors and concepts that are being brought together here. So Christ is not withdrawn from world affairs as he ascends into heaven, which we see in the book of Acts, at the beginning of the book of Acts. He's not withdrawn from world affairs, but his followers, through his followers, he's continuing to exercise his royal and priestly functions. And with all of this, Christ receiving authority in verses 7 and 9 should be seen as an enthronement. And this is especially so as chapter 1, verse 5, Christ's resurrection leads to his office as ruler of the kings of the earth. So all of that from chapter 1 has been brought forward into chapter 5 and made a little bit more robust. Verses 11 to 12 now, the hymn, the next hymn further interprets the slain but risen lamb's reception of the book to mean that his death and resurrection make him worthy to receive praise and glory. So not only is he worthy to open the scroll, but it makes it worthy to receive praise and glory. Then I looked and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne and the living creatures and the elders, and the number of them was myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands. That myriads and myriads, thousands and thousands, taken again from Daniel chapter 7, verse 10. So we're following the Daniel pattern. And the repeated mention of Ezekiel's cherubim is now combined with the scene in Daniel 7, verse 10. So that's all put together here. Saying with a loud voice, worthy is the lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. So First Chronicles chapter 29, verses 11 to 12 stand behind this combination of words: power, wealth, might, glory. And then wisdom comes from Daniel chapter 2, verse 20. So the wisdom in Daniel 2 and here in Revelation 5:12 has this eschatological association with the divine kingdom. So it's not surprising then when we find the other words from Daniel chapter 2, verse 37, and chapter 4, verse 30 of might and glory and honor are all put together. And then we have verses 13 and 14. So this hymn, this next hymn, further interprets the risen Lamb's reception of the book to mean that his death and his resurrection has made him worthy to receive praise and glory. The emphasis on glorifying Christ is enhanced by the fact that God also is glorified because it was through his sovereign plan, through God's sovereign plan, redemption was brought about through Christ. So this also highlights that Christ is in the same divine position as God and will likewise be glorified. The glory of God and of the Lamb are grounded in their sovereignty. And that's the main point of chapter 4 and 5, those two visions, the sovereignty of God, the one who sits on the throne, and of the Lamb who was slain. And every created thing which is in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all things in them, I heard saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and dominion forever and ever. So this scene anticipates the universal acclamation that is going to be offered at the consummation of all things. This is a universal praise that comes from God's willing subjects, as well as opponents who have been forced into submission. And this is a good example of the already and the not yet time reference of chapter 4 and 5. This has already begun, but it's not consummated, it's not fulfilled. It awaits a consummation in the future. The evil rulers and the earth dwellers will be judged because they do not submit to and praise the sovereignty of Christ while they live on the earth. And the four living creatures kept saying, Amen, and the elders fell down and worshiped. So a couple more things about verse 13. Let me just go back. The fivefold expression of praise in verse 13, the first half of it, may be a collection of Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, Psalm 146, verse 6, and Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6. God is praised as creator of the manifold creation and as king over Israel, who has delivered his people from bondage. Therefore, they will, in the earlier influence of kingdom and Passover themes, these fit in with the earlier influence of the kingdom and Passover themes that we've seen from Exodus in chapter 5 here. So he is worthy because of this, what he has done in creation and through the deliverance of his people from bondage. Verse 14, and the four living creatures kept saying, Amen, and the elders fell down and worshiped. So the vision ends by the heavenly representatives of all of animate creation and of the church confirming the praise by pronouncing a final Amen and worshiping. So that, my friends, is chapter 5. Questions, comments, discussions? So the takeaway is that Jesus, by his death and resurrection, is worthy to execute God's divine plan of both redeeming his people and giving them an inheritance and executing judgment on those who have oppressed God's people and has refused to worship God himself. And of course, those two things are linked, the oppression of God's people and the refusal to worship God. I'll let you sit and think for a second while I look up the questions. Okay.
Like I kind of get on verse 11 and 12, it's even like, it always gives credibility when you hear more people saying the same thing. So in this case, the word is myriads and myriads and thousands
Yes.
with a loud voice. So it's like, it's making such a strong emphasis of what he heard. He's hearing all these voices, all these praises. That's kind of, to me, that's very awesome.
Yes.
That vision was there, seeing one thing, but actually hearing it. How could somebody hear this? It's just incredible what emphasis is there.
Yeah. Good. Other thoughts or comments? Questions?
I didn't really see any of those options for the book standing out above the rest. Some of them, like Old Testament, didn't make sense at all.
Okay.
Where do you land, or where do you think it is? Is it a plan of judgment and redemption?
Yeah.
It seems to be kind of the thing that fit the
fits
best.
with with what I see. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, we have some questions to go through. In Peterson's chapter 7. So I created 7 questions, but as always, if you have questions that you prefer to talk about, we can do that. Everybody has a copy of the questions? I can share my screen if I need to, but I would rather not if I don't need to.
Yeah. Oh, okay. You'd rather not? I'll find it then. No problem.
Let me see. Hold on a second. Okay. Share options. Oh, that's not. Share screen. Do you see them now?
Yes, I did. No, I don't.
Oh. Okay. I lose you guys when I share my screen. That's why I'd rather not. Here we go. Okay. All right. So there's the questions. First one is pastoral nature. How is your reliance on prayer in the midst of the chaotic times like COVID? Again, you may not feel comfortable enough to share that personally. All right, let's go to number 2 then. Why do the prayers of Christians need to be mixed with incense? I thought that was an interesting insight on Peterson's part.
Rose has an answer.
All right,
Well, I
Rose.
think we all have a Well, I think our prayers need to be purified because our prayers are imperfect, and we also need God's power to fill our prayers and empower them. Yeah. So I think there's 2 reasons. We want to collaborate with God.
Good.
I mean, our prayers can be biased or selfish, or they can be an opposite agenda, an opposite method of a method that God wants. So we need our prayers to be filtered. I don't know, purified.
No, I think that's a fine answer. I think that is both realistic and takes some pressure off, doesn't it? Did anybody have any other thoughts that they wanted to contribute to that? All right. We had question 3. Does understanding that our prayers move from heaven to earth empower your prayer life? And if so, why and how? So I was really struck by
Well,
that.
that's a,
Go ahead, Mom.
oh, I was going to say probably similar to what you were going to say. That really resonated with me. It was not a concept that I'd ever thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
That our prayers go up to heaven, to God, and then come back
Mm-hmm.
to the earth to work changes, and that just gave me the idea or the thought that isn't just sort of going up into the ether, even if there's no answer right away. It's like, I don't know, it's like makes it more powerful somehow.
Mm-hmm. So I just, as I was listening to you, had the thought that, we just said, as we worked through chapter 5, that Christ is not absent from the affairs of the world, but that he still continues to fulfill his royal and priestly roles through his people. And I would say that prayer is probably the connecting bridge there.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And that somehow that encourages me more. I mean, as well as what we just talked about, which is even though our prayers may not be perfect, they're uplifted somehow with being blended with, mixed with the incense, whatever. It's kind of like, don't stop, it's encouraging to carry on.
Yes.
Regardless of how futile we may feel it is sometimes.
Well, and that marries very nicely with Romans 8 that we looked at some time back when we worked through Romans. Let me just pull it up here. In the same way, so this is 8 verse 26, in the same way the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So I think that fits very nicely in this biblical theology of prayer. Anybody else struck by that? Do anything for you? Or was that just a ho-hum? No big deal. I already knew that.
No, definitely for me, it also had that same effect of making it more significant prayers. Well, God's listening. Just to have it stated that way makes it more real.
Cool. Well, then we had question 4. What is the meaning of this tension that Peterson is trying to describe as he sort of explores these two phrases? John is on the island called Patmos, and John is in the Spirit on the Lord's day. What's he doing here, guys?
That one was interesting for me, the sort of juxtaposing being alone and being in community at the same time. So on the island, he's clearly not there by by choice, and he's in exile or by himself. And yet in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, he's so connected. He's in communion with God. And so it's kind of the idea that our prayers are individual. They're very separate from other people and things and places. And yet we're never more in communion and connection with God than when we're praying. And then if you add corporate prayer to that, it just kind of adds another level of depth to it.
Mhm. Good.
Rose wants to add.
Oh, does somebody else want to talk? Does somebody else want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, the whole
Go ahead.
imagery of John being locked away by himself on an island. Ha ha ha, you can't do anything now. You're in exile. No power. You know, it's like no matter what you see, no matter what the forces may be, it's like crazy forces against you. They're no match to being in the Spirit.
Mm.
And I like that contrast. So no matter, like in our day-to-day affairs, it might look like you're locked away, nobody knows, you're all by yourself, but the reality and the awareness that you're in the Spirit, that the Spirit is guiding you, the Spirit in you is there and alive. I like that contrast. There's
Mhm.
that it's like there's no way to be defeated.
Oh,
Good.
I think Bob said that beautifully. But I think like there's two realities here. He really is stuck on Patmos, and he's really in reality under the power of the emperor. And, I mean, he's alone. He has a lot of things he doesn't have with him. And, you know, visitors is one of them. And yet the other reality that eclipses that is the spiritual reality. I think Bob said that so well.
Mhm.
So which reality? I mean, the spiritual reality is bigger, it eclipses it.
Mhm.
And I mean, in a little bit, it's kind of like, it's like COVID. I mean, we're restricted, we're bound a bit, we're hampered. There's a lot of things that we can't have, you know, greet each other with a holy kiss, gather together and I'll be with you. And yet we have the spiritual reality
Mhm.
that God is, you know, we're in the Spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can be in the Spirit anytime.
And I think that it's important that we realize that being in the Spirit on the Lord's Day doesn't nullify or negate the reality of the island of Patmos. This isn't escapism. This is, in some ways, again, it mirrors the Lamb who was slain, right? That sense of through powerlessness comes power. And so, yeah, even in our present situation or crisis, I think it's really important for us as believers to be reminded that if we walk by the Spirit, again, to use Paul's language, then that reality that we are seated in the heavenlies, that we are already with Christ in his resurrection, that we are already ruling and reigning with him, it helps us to see the temporariness of our present situation, which I think often threatens to overcome us because it seems like the only reality, or it seems like the total picture. And I think that's the real importance of examining a book like Revelation, or examining the book of Revelation at a time like this in our history, because it's so easy to slide into depression or feel some form of defeat or fear. And here
Mhm.
comes this beautiful picture that doesn't deny the importance or fearsomeness of COVID and all that kind of stuff. And yet we are not shackled by or limited to that picture of reality.
Yeah, I found that whole aspect of it very encouraging because unlike you folks there in Regina, churches here in Toronto are not going to be opening anytime soon.
Right.
We've rolled back to phase 2, and you know our COVID case spikes now are like well above the highest peaks back in April. So I don't know where this is going.
Yeah.
But just the idea that even though I'm at home in front of my computer, going to my church service, your church service, doesn't matter. What's important is that we are together. It's the people who are the church, not the
Right.
building.
Yeah.
And I just find this sort of reinforcing and encouraging.
Yeah.
And the other piece for me is, how does the prayer combine those two ideas? Is the verse where he talks about where there's myriad voices, like thousands and thousands
Yeah.
of voices are there with them at
Mhm.
the same time.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And then question 5 was, why is the silence in heaven so important to Christian suffering or to suffering Christians?
Sort of tells us God is listening. Heaven has
Mhm.
taken a few minutes to hear what we're saying.
Yeah. How did that strike you?
I better say something that matters. That
Okay.
that someone is listening. Yeah, it's important to speak your heart,
Yeah.
and this is, I guess, make the most of that conversation with God.
Others, how did that strike you? That concept that there's this heavenly hush that falls so that God can listen to your prayers.
Yeah.
Rose says,
We have
wow.
to say it's like, wow, God is really listening to us. And I put dignity, respect, value, worth, consideration, and inclusion.
Mhm.
Like, we're important to God. We're
Mhm.
precious. I guess that's why he died for us.
Mhm.
It's wow.
Yeah.
It's like, oh,
How often do we think about our prayer life? I think my mom said it a few moments ago, like my words are just going up into the ether kind of thing. I mean, for myself, a lot of the time as I pray, I'm conscious of myself praying, but I'm not necessarily conscious of God listening. And God just seems in my own mind so active, right? He's got the managing of the whole cosmos to be about, and he's a busy fella. And I don't want to take up too much of his time, kind of thing. But I was struck by heavens fall silent so that God can take the time to listen to our prayers. To me, that was just a game changer regarding a theology of prayer. He's
think
not
too,
multitasking.
I think too, it also impresses upon us how important silence is.
Talk about that, Bob.
It did for me. Well, that's a big part of prayer. Isn't just unloading everything that's in our hearts, unloading. In this case, it's a reference to Christians that are going through traumatic times. They're suffering. They're in pain. But sometimes the best comes when we're quiet.
Mhm.
Sometimes the Lord speaks, and sometimes he doesn't speak. And even in the silence of not speaking, it's enough.
Mm.
You don't have to try to make something up or try to draw some kind of imagery of what is it? Why is there a quietness? You can feel the presence of the Lord better for me, the peace of Christ is there when you're quiet,
Mhm.
instead of when you're, I don't know, you're sometimes you're too active.
Yeah.
But if you just slow down, stop, be quiet, still yourself, it's powerful.
Mhm.
How do you, I don't know how to explain it, but it's the presence of the Lord in silence is pretty awesome.
That's good. It's probably why it's one of the traditional classic disciplines, right?
Yeah.
There's John practicing his solitude and silence on the island of Patmos in the Spirit on the Lord's day. So then, how do the trumpet metaphors emerging out of prayers shape your imagination for what prayer is and does?
Well, again, I thought the whole reference back to Jericho,
Mhm.
and the basically they conquered the city, this walled city, by obeying God and marching around and blowing the trumpets in obeying God and doing it at the timing that He said to do it.
Yep.
I thought that's pretty powerful image.
Yeah. If you're talking
was
to
pretty-
us, Carla, you're muted. I don't know if, were you talking to us, Carla?
No, sorry, I'm saying goodnight to Luke.
No, that's okay. I just
You're
didn't
fine.
want to miss what you were saying.
No, thanks for checking.
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I mean, to me, every aspect of the blowing of the trumpet, and all the symbols that it showed throughout the Old Testament was powerful, because I blow the shofar, and it sure made me think a lot. Because I do get thoughts through my head when I'm blowing the shofar. Why am I blowing the shofar? What is it meaning? And I do get, senses of why I'm blowing it. But when I read this all through, it's like all through history, these were all signs and a triggering, and an advancement. All this was all what a very important aspect of why you blew this trumpet, this sound. And the fact that we're going to hear the trumpet sound when Christ comes and returns to earth. So it's like, it's not something to be taken lightly. It's a signal. And I got lots to think about, and I like to I need to read this more and more to see the importance of this blowing, this sound, because for some reason, God's kind of led me to blow, to make a noise, to make a sound. And sometimes I understand it, sometimes I don't. So I think I have lots to learn.
Yeah. Well, and make sure you're keeping account of how many times you blow it in the sanctuary, because 7 times the whole place could come down.
Yeah, and our walls aren't that thick. We got a good roof, but I don't know about walls.
So yeah, again, this kind of ties back into our question 2, right? Question 3
7.
Works together here. This is our prayers participating in God's actions, and that metaphor is the trumpet metaphor of God being at work with our prayers. I've heard us talk about responsibility. I don't know. For me, it's this co-laboring with God. Again, we've talked about the proclamation of the gospel, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to those who believe. I just feel like that's all related together. You know, the place of prayer in our witness is so important. Prayer in our world. Think of those who are suffering as our neighbors. You know, part of our mission statement. No, our mission statement at Northview is to embody Christ in our neighborhoods, and I think that includes prayer for our neighborhoods, for our neighbors, for salvation certainly, but also for justice to be done, for transformation to occur. I just feel like it's big. I really like too that he pointed out the sevens in that Jericho passage too, 7 priests and 7 ram's horns on the 7th day and 7 times. Really important. So then our last question is, how does Peterson's reading of the judgments in Revelation chapter 8 shape or change the way you have read or been taught to read the book of Revelation? Now, Carla, I just want to point out to you that for years you've been participating in Christian Ed, and you have always been somebody with lots of questions and lots of comments.
Where are they?
And it has been 7 weeks now with Rose at your side, and you have been the mute operator.
Well, because it's going over my head. Mostly. The jumping back and forth to all the references is because I've never studied because I've never studied the Old Testament. It's all new for me. So the jumping back and forth, and I am completely exhausted. So most of the time I'm just focusing on staying awake. But the first thought that I had on after 6 months of doing nothing, jumping back into routine has been really hard. But what I was going to say about the 7th one is, I don't know, I'll let you know when I'm done this, because I've never been taught how to read Revelation.
Okay.
So yeah,
Yep.
I don't know. But,
My comment wasn't a condemnation of you.
oh, I know.
It was just
I totally know.
He's trying to
Yeah.
speak up.
drawing
Oh,
you
yeah.
in to
No,
participate
Oh no, I know you're razzing me. It's all good.
and
It
give
wouldn't be
yourself
Christian
more
Ed if you don't
credit.
razz me.
It's not all over
You
your
have-
head. You're getting it.
I think it's probably sinking in more, but than I think it is. But yeah.
Yep. Just keep that nostril above the
And
water.
I'm
You're fine.
of course, I'm way behind in my reading too. I'm finding the book very, like Rose said, it's very beautifully written. I say, yeah, it sure is. It's just really thick. So
Okay.
yeah, the last book last semester was great. This one's a little thicker. So,
Right.
but
It's
Right.
a lot of adjectives.
yeah, yes, a lot of
Similar
adjectives.
to
So
that.
Yes,
Metaphors.
he's a very
The-
poetic writer.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
and I'm not into poetry at all. So a poetic writer combined with the poetry of Revelation.
Oh,
But hey,
I feel you, dog.
yeah, exactly right.
I'm
But
still
I'm taking it in.
I'm still trying to figure out the book for our next semester so that I don't kill anybody. You can pray
You could
about
have
that.
taken this book a little slower, maybe.
Your
Yeah.
thoughtfulness is appreciated, Dave.
Slower. 1 chapter a week. We're okay.
Oh, I'm taking Peterson's book a little slower
Yeah.
instead
No,
of rushing him.
there's
He's
no
got a
need
lot of
for
good
that, Bob.
points.
No need for that. 1 chapter a week. You're just fine.
I like what Peterson said, if you're in reference to chapter or question 7, he uses such succinct ways of explaining it. Like Genesis, he says we see everything is a result of God's creative will.
Mhm.
And Revelation is everything is subject to God's creative judgment.
Mhm.
So it's like, you're right. It kind of opens up your mind to how important Revelation is.
Mhm.
It shouldn't be a kind of confusing book. I don't understand. It's an important book we have to embrace. And like the chapter 8's talking about the blowing of the trumpets and all these things look like they're happening to, well, they are not looking like they're going to happen to the earth. But it's like, when you think of it in the sense of it's supposed to be, that's the judgment, it makes sense. This is the world that was created, but now this is what's become, and it has to be judged.
Well, and that's where
It's
I
powerful.
really want to zone in on what Peterson is saying here. So when any of the great elements of creation get between us and God, becoming idols, judgment
Yeah.
topples them and restores us to simple trust and adoration. Every misplaced trust and every mistaken devotion is called into question.
Mhm.
So for him, the judgments are not meant to annihilate people in the earth. They are, in fact, attempts of God to bring people back to faithfulness.
Yeah.
Just like the plagues in Egypt were meant to change Pharaoh's heart. God's judgment is meant to bring his people, his creation, back to himself. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a final judgment where, and again, I like Lewis's terms, there can only be, in the end, those who say to God, your will be done, or those to whom God says, your will be done. If you do not want life with the Creator in the creation, that is fine, you won't have it. If you do want life with the Creator in the creation, that is fine, you will have it. But there will come a final choice.
I can't see Ed on my screen, but I'm sure Ed has something to say about that.
Well, it definitely is a challenging book. There you have it.
Peterson's or Revelation?
Both.
Okay. Okay. Well, my friends, it is 8:36. I've taken you 6 minutes over our agreed upon time. I apologize. So why don't we pray and then get ready to go? And I'm thinking Chad Frentz probably wants to pray for us.
Sure. Lord, thank you for your word, and for the effort and persistence and struggle that those people represented here are putting into wanting to understand. And thank you for illuminating it bit by bit here. And I pray that you would continue to walk with us as we study this and just bring clarity and new ideas and new understanding and encouragement to us through what we read and hear her. Thank you for this group, and I pray that you'd walk with us this week. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, folks. Have a nice week, and we'll see you
Night,
soon.
everyone.
Good night. Have a good week.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Night.
Ready?